G'day, friends. Miloa here. Today we've got a jam-packed session for you talking about everything related to offensive synergies. A lot of time and effort has gone towards putting this session together. I've got Sape and some of my other friends here with me today to help present this, and I'm super excited about it. Over to you, Sape.
Hey everyone, so this is going to be a fairly advanced part one video of a breakdown of how to best accomplish the most difficult content in the game, or just in general in group content, how to optimize your group DPS as well as your personal DPS, and all of the various factors that go into coordinating specifically your cooldowns, your buffs, your debuffs, your self buffs and group buffs, um, the targets and timing, as well as positioning is all involved, and the group composition, and how that affects how you should approach timing things properly. A lot of the time in especially tier 1 content, people will just basically be playing as if they were, in landscape or whatever, not really like trying to optimize group damage, but carrying, or even their personal damage, because if they were trying to, if everyone does try to optimize group damage, then everyone does more personal damage as well. And the fight lasts a lot. It does not carry on as long. You don't get as many overlapping mechanics. You don't have cooldowns run out and expire nearly as frequently. There's not as much incoming damage. Just the importance of having a proper strategy and group composition and making sure that everyone is on the same page as far as the mechanics of the fight go and the priorities of when to unleash the most damage and how to sequence your skills and which ones are the most important to keep up and when to use specific huge buffs, or skills that will really affect everyone's damage for burst phases or burn phases. First, I'm going to cover what what the group composition in 6-person and 12-person tier 2 and 3 content should ideally be. You should not ideally layer any of the same class and same spec. And you want, obviously, in 6-person content, a tank and a healer. You want 2 DPS that are ideally either both physical or both tactical. You want a debuffer, meaning Yellow Berg, Yellow Lore Master, and then alternatively Yellow Hunter and Yellow Mariner. And you want a DPS support, meaning Red Captain, Blue Mariner, or alternatively Blue Lore Master. That is the setup that is required to accomplish, for instance, Tier 3 well. It's virtually impossible if you do not have all 4 roles in a 6-person group present to accomplish the hardest content in the game. And that group makeup will always be better for both offensive and defensive purposes than if you were to lose the debuffer or the DPS support for another DPS, for instance. There are a few exceptions in fights where sometimes you need 2 healers or 2 debuffers, but in general, this is how it goes. For raids, you want 2 tanks for most content, sometimes 1, and occasionally, at least in past raids, 3 are ideal. But you don't want them to be of the same class. And you can check the description, the link to the Intro to Raid Dynamics video that I made several months ago, if you want more information about this. But 2 tanks, 2 healers, and once again, not of the same class. Ideally, in most situations, a blue minstrel and blue runekeeper. Um, there are some fights where you actually want 3 healers, and normally the third is a yellow bear. Um, and then blue captain, of course, is also an option. As far as tanks go, you want a guard for almost all content, period, as one of the tanks. And then the second, um, for um, for especially the purposes of this video, the most important, most uh, contributing tank class to offensive to the group's offensive capacity is brawler. Um, and I would say that if you don't have a Bjorning in another spec in the raid, and Bjorning would be next most potent. However, if you do have another Bjorning, then um, because in so many of the specs, as we'll demonstrate, because in most of the specs, the debuffs that they provide are across the board. Like red has an extra one, but blue and yellow, you want a bear, and ideally a red one. But anyway, um, and there's also captain as an a yellow captain as an option, but they don't provide hardly any offensive buffs or debuffs or utility whatsoever. They're really about their defensive tanks for both themselves and the group. Um, Warden is an option um, that will provide a good amount of mid shreds, but other than that, not too much utility. Oh, and then finally there's champion, and if you don't have another champion and you want to bring a champion, um, they have more group utility, especially with the 6 set DMK in blue set bonus than you may expect. You want 2 tanks, 2 healers, 2 DPS support classes, um, ideally red captain and blue mariner, and you need them especially coordinate very, very specifically um, their cooldowns and to know what the other is doing and for you to utilize their m- enormously potent offensive buffs as well as debuffs um, appropriately. And of course, you want 4 DPS, um, and the only one that I'm going to cover in this in part 1 of this guide, so to speak, is Red Minstrel, because they're somewhat of a support as well as provide such significant personal damage as well that they should be included. But in part 2, we're going to go into the the general strategy and approach that DPS should take to utilizing their self buffs, their debuffs, their bleeds, um, and setting things up for optimizing damage and how all of them can contribute and how like I mentioned with 6-person groups, it's best for the DPS to be largely either tactical or physical, not both usually. Um, in the meta right now, it's mostly tactical because the debuffs and that especially that are provided by tactical classes buff the other tactical classes damage so significantly that in general you want your DPS to be one or the other, not both. With the possible exception right now of Red Bear still being in the meta because of the debuffs that that Red Bear provides, as well as the amount of damage. And then you want two debuffers. A Yellow Lore Master and Yellow Berg are ideal, but alternatively, you can also bring a Yellow Hunter um, or a Yellow Mariner, though they provide a lot more crowd control than offensive and defensive um, debuffs and utility to the group. So, basically, you're going to need to realize that can't just like the goal is not in fights to um, open up with as much damage as you can personally do. You need to have strategy going into a fight. Like you need to know the mechanics beforehand. You need to know the group composition that you have, and the raid leader especially needs to know exactly what the most important offensive skills for the group are. The like their effects, their durations, their cooldowns, everything. And to synchronize uh, callouts for optimizing burn phases, especially, as well as um, to make sure that you have as many debuffs and root buffs, debuffs on the enemy for like incoming damage and especially mitigation decreases, um, as well as group offensive buffs. Um, anything that increases damage, crit chance, etc., and self um, offensive buffs should generally be saved until the big burn phases are called and coordinated with them. Um, Everyone needs to know, and I'll mention this at the beginning, the most important skill in the game, called greatness. Um, Everyone needs to know which skill it resets, and the timing of it needs to be very, very precise, and there needs to be a countdown once it's called out to give everyone time if the skill that it resets is not on cooldown for them to use it so that it will after it Call to Greatness is used be usable again. Um, and it's best to go into a fight like knowing how long before you're going to use the first Call to Greatness and planning like roughly the exact second, um, the amount of seconds into the fight that it will be used, so that people can use the skills that have durations that are longer than that at the very beginning, um, if they wish, or before it at least. Um, so um, you need to understand that you shouldn't be playing reactively um, in most fights, especially if they're DPS races. You should be creating windows for damage where and during which the group is going to be doing at least 300, sometimes up to 500% of the damage that they are um, during the rest of the fight. And you need to know the mechanics of the fight as far as the priority targets go, the timing of like windows where enemies are particularly vulnerable, the times when everyone is going to need to, especially healers and tanks, focus more on keeping themselves and everyone else alive. So you don't want to coincide your burn phases with, you know, periods of the fight where everyone's taking a ton of damage, because you're going to have to be using defensive skills rather than offensive, and you're not going to do as much. Um, Sometimes you don't really have a choice, um, but in general, that's what's required to accomplish the hardest content in the game. Um, if you don't have enough group DPS, and especially if you don't uh, utilize it on the right targets, and if people do not know the priority of how to optimize everyone's damage at once and layer buffs and debuffs, and then utilize their bleeds before burn phases, and and then refresh them if they need to be during them, and then their big skills during it, then you simply will not be able to clear the hardest content in the game. Too many mechanics will overlap, the fight will take too long, tanks will and healers will run out of cooldowns. Um, it's it, this is what's required to actually reach high levels of 6 and 10 and 12 person play. So need to all realize that there are so many buffs and as well as heals in this game that are group wide or raid wide, that have a very, very small radius, and importance of, unless the mechanics of the fight demand that you spread out, or that you have some people away from the group, importance of staying as tightly stacked as possible, tanks excluded, obviously. Um, not, Sometimes actually tanks as well, if there are no frontals, for instance, um, is absolutely critical to getting the benefits of so many of the damage buffs, the defensive buffs, the self heals. Everyone needs to stay stacked and move together in order to optimize damage, especially during burn phases. Um, you cannot be spread out um, and do nearly as much damage, um, like even slightly spread out. I'm talking, like, pretend that you're all one body as much as possible. Um, DPS, healers, debuffers, DPS support, all of it. Um, and that is very, very important. As I mentioned, especially during the burn phases, for all of the buffs to properly align, um, and for everybody to be able to really unleash and at the right times and get through the uh, the most difficult portions of the fight, um, that require the DPS race windows, which over half of the fights in this game, at even mid level, but even tier 2, but also tier 3 content require. Um, so as far as raids go, at least. So, um, you need to also understand that the tanks, um, if they're not taking damage, should be trying to buff the group's damage, especially at the right times, the burn phases, as much as possible, if they're not at risk of dying. And that's, for instance, guardians sacrificing their fortifications for use breaking ranks, like during the first Oathis phase, burn phase, and then in on future ones or on cooldown. It's very important to know as well the um, the limitations of skills that will cause effects when used on a target, where um, skills that do the same effect or provide the same effect on that target and not be used again um, um, for and the duration um, that lasts, and that skills that cannot be overlapped, those that have shared effects. And if you do overlap them, then you're just only one of them will be applied, and sometimes less potent ones will actually override more potent ones if used um, in after the more potent one is used. Um, so that's especially important when it comes to the DPS support, but it's also quite important for the debuffers to coordinate as well. Um, their um, abilities, especially their most important debuff, which is the um, mitigation shred that's called Major Rent, which they need to alternate the skills that cause it, um, like in order to have it have 100% uptime, um, and that needs to be very precisely done. There are also shared effects that are applied to the group from certain buffs, as well as effects that when you use certain skills, like Call to Greatness or Two Arms um, from Red Captain and Blue Mariner, um, you have a period of time before you the next version of those. Um, and there are skills that, as I mentioned, have shared effects that if you use multiples that do the same thing, they are only one of them is going to apply. And so you're wasting, for instance, if you use both banners um, like at the same time of a red captain and a blue mariner, even though you can, only one of them is going to affect the group. Um, so it's really, really important to coordinate and to have a raid leader that understands the priority order, the raid composition, and um, like go that goes into a fight with a very specific plan of how to optimize offensive synergy, and especially, as I mentioned, during DPS race fights, um, as well as at the beginning of every fight, unless at the very beginning you're taking massive and massive amounts of damage. In general, it's best to wait at least 8 seconds after you engage fight um, for everyone to be able to first apply their mitigation shreds, because mitigation shreds are the most overpowered thing in this game. Every class has a skill that can provide at least 3% mitigation decrease to a target, and the debuffing classes especially can provide way, way more, and all of them stack. That's one of the reasons that it's not ideal to bring multiples of the same class to um, a raid, especially not the same spec. So you want to get up your mitigation shreds and maintain them at all times. But before the um, the burn phase begins, which depending on the fight and the group composition should be between 5, generally at least 8, and up to 15 seconds. And this should be planned beforehand. You want to prioritize debuffs, group buffs, and you want to know the duration of your group buffs as well as the radius. And you want to use them, use the most potent ones uh, right before the burn phases so that they last throughout the duration of it. Same thing with self buffs, but you also want to get up your personal debuffs that will, for instance, increase incoming damage um, or decrease crit defense, etc. on the target. And then you want to apply your damage over time effects, especially the long ones, uh, before trophies or before the burn phase starts. Um, as well as I mentioned, use your skill that Call to Greatness is going to reset unless you're saving Call to Greatness. You only have, for instance, one minstrel as it has a 7-minute cooldown, unless you're saving it for later in the fight. But in general, you're going to be using one Call of Greatness early um, during, in most high tier group content.
Thank you everybody who participated in today's video, as well as Sape that spent a considerable amount of time putting all of this together. Thank you so much. And as always, guys, happy hunting.